So now we come down to reality again, and of course, current geopolitical configurations in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, are still very central to us in the debates, in the news, and of course, it's at the heart of this forum as well. So we're very happy to have the first panel of today that is led in collaboration with the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. So we're very happy to welcome the moderator and speaker, Mohamed Mohamedou, Deputy Director and Professor of International History and Politics at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. Please, very warm welcome, Professor. أهلا وسهلا. تفضل.
And of course, in the tradition of the MEM, the geopolitical panel is one of the most important. It repeats every year, but it's never the same discussion. This is something I can tell you from experience. Now, our next guest is someone from my close region. It's Karim Emile Bitar, who's a professor of international relations and director of the Institute of Political Science at Saint Joseph University in Beirut. أهلا وسهلا, Karim. The next speaker, unfortunately, could not join us in person, which is why you see the screen there, but it's also something that we got out of COVID. We learned how to continue to work together, even a bit with screens. The next speaker is Cinzia Bianco, who's a research fellow on Europe and the Gulf at the European Council for Foreign Relations, ECFR. Hello, Cinzia.
Buongiorno.
Benvenuti. Do you hear us? See, she's muted. The Zoom things would never change.
So the next distinguished guest is somebody who's been already a very valued guest in the past issues and events at the forum here. It's Professor Matteo Legrenzi. He's a distinguished professor at Foscari University of Venice. Very warm welcome, Professor, please. Benvenuto. And the young changemaker of the region, it's Adi Horesh. Very warm welcome to the podium to discuss this first panel. Toda raba. Please.
Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you, Zakaria, for your very nice welcome. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to welcome you warmly to the first panel of the 2023 Middle East Mediterranean Summer Summit here. This first panel will be looking at current geopolitical configurations in the Middle East and the Mediterranean regions, and we have 4 excellent speakers whom I will introduce in a moment. I would like to start by thanking the different speakers that we have heard this morning for their inspiring and insightful comments. Prorector Cantoni, President Gamba, State Councillor Guschetti, Federal Councillor Cassis for the welcoming opening addresses. My thank as well to Minister Ben Said, Special Rapporteur Zantaki, Ambassador Ducret for their insightful comments. I really also want to thank for the excellent preparations all the team here that has been putting together the different editions, and particularly this edition of the Summer Summit, which is really emerging as a very, very important moment to discuss these issues internationally, not just regionally. I'd like to recognize Federica Frediani, the Dr. Frediani, who's responsible for the project, for the excellent preparations, and all her colleagues. And of course, Diana and Zakaria for their excellent comments so far. The Geneva Graduate Institute is particularly delighted to collaborate with the forum for organizing this panel. And I would say more generally to collaborate and expand our collaboration with the Università della Svizzera Italiana internationally. It's very important for us to have these bridges. I want to turn now to the topic of our conversation this morning. The Middle East, the Mediterranean region, has been experiencing a lot of transformations in recent years. I think we can look at roughly a benchmark of about 10 years, 12 years or so, if we're looking at the Arab Spring from there on. There's been so many developments, so much has been happened that we have to look at this, take a little bit of a horizon scanning, but also an assessment of the meaning politically, geopolitically, societally of all of these issues. And to do that, we have 4 excellent speakers who I'd like to introduce and get us started on the conversation. To my immediate left is Professor Karim Bitar. Karim Bitar is Professor of International Relations and Director of the Institute of Political Science at the Saint Joseph University in Beirut. Welcome, Karim. Delighted to see you as usual. On his left, online, very sorry that she could not be with us, but welcoming her is Dr. Cinzia Bianco, who is a research fellow on the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf at the European Council on Foreign Relations and a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Dr. Bianco. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.
We welcome. And then to the next speaker is Matteo Legrenzi, who is a professor of international relations at the Foscari University of Venice. And he has served previously in different capacities, highlighting only their major achievements or highlight some points as president of the Italian Association for Middle Eastern Studies. Welcome, Professor Legrenzi, welcoming you back here. And I want to mention that Dr. Bianco and Professor Legrenzi have recently jointly co-authored a book on the Arab monarchy of the Gulf, the new center of gravity in the Middle East. And we are also joined by a representative of the youth summit that has been mentioned, who are taking part in the summit, Adi Horesh. Adi, very nice to have you with us. Very much looking forward to hearing your views and the perspectives. Ladies and gentlemen, we will proceed in the following manner. I will have some opening remarks from the panelists. We will engage in a conversation exchanging with them, and then I will take time to open the floor for Q&A and take your questions at a later stage. And we'll certainly make sure to take time for this. Time is of the essence. Karim, I'd like to start with you. Want to get your take on what I've been mentioning. There's any number of points we can look at. If we focus on the geopolitical aspect, the panels later on today will address different dimensions of the transformations. But geopolitically, there's been really kind of almost a defining moment, I would say, in the larger history of what we're observing. That is, over the past 10, 15 years, roughly, depending on where you put the cursor. I mentioned the Arab Spring. We have had the Syrian civil war. We have had, of course, the whole ISIS episode. We have had diplomatic crises that are forgotten today, the Qatar and GCC rift of 2017 to 2019. There's been so many of these different transformations, but also what we're observing is a repositioning of the area towards the rest of the world in sectors. What, in your view, are the elements that you would like to highlight and that you would like us to sort of take as we engage in this conversation?
Thank you very much, dear Mahmoud. I would like to say, by seconding what you said when you congratulated the keynote speakers for their inspiring words and to commend the organizers of this fantastic conference, I can think of no better place than the cosmopolitan city of Lugano to think about the challenges in the contemporary Middle East. I come from Beirut. I'm very attached to this tradition of Levantine cosmopolitanism, and the greatest challenge today is to reconcile democratic citizenship and appease the existential angst of religious minorities and all sorts of minorities. As you said, we have witnessed an extraordinary acceleration of history in the past few years, and even in the past 6 or 7 months. 7 months ago, we were in the midst of an Iranian uprising that was unprecedented since 1979. Proxy wars were raging across the Middle East and North Africa. And today, the key word is de-escalation, I think. We have witnessed an unexpected and important rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia that was brokered by the Chinese. I think this is definitely very significant, even if we have not yet seen the repercussions on the various arenas, because we have to remember that a few months ago we had several Middle Eastern states that were on the verge of disintegration, Yemen, Libya, Lebanon, and all these tragedies were related to this proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So today I would think that I would tend to be a bit more optimistic than we were a few months ago. I think we are also witnessing a significant shift in Turkish foreign policy. However, this détente, this de-escalation should not lead us to forget that the key social and economic problems that triggered the Arab revolutions of 2011 are still very much present. And the demonstrations that are occurring today and yesterday in Suwaida in Syria are a testimony to the fact that even though the counter-revolution triumphed almost in every single country in the region, Tunisia and Sudan were the last bastions of hope, and today they have also succumbed either to civil war or to a return to full-fledged authoritarianism. So the root causes of the Arab uprisings of 2011 are still present. However, if this Iranian-Saudi rapprochement leads to a modus vivendi that would solve the Lebanese crisis, the presidential vacuum in Lebanon, the Yemeni civil war, would allow Syria to progressively rebuild its institutions, it would definitely be a step forward. However, at a time when these proxy wars are receding, we are witnessing an intensification of the culture wars in the Middle East. Regimes that have failed are trying to scapegoat minorities, and this goes beyond the Middle East and North Africa. In Pakistan, the Christian minorities is being persecuted. In Lebanon and other countries, the Syrian refugees or the sexual minorities are being targeted by both Christians and Muslim politicians on both sides of the political spectrum. On both sides of the Iranian-Saudi divide, you have counter-revolutionary forces, reactionary forces that are trying to prevent the emergence of democratic, open, inclusive societies in the Middle East.
Thank you very much, Karim. To what do you owe this diplomatic kind of dynamic that we see of late? Because if you look at what's really been happening over the past couple of years, we have had the usual issues of conflict, the questions of course, economic development and so on, and insecurity. But this diplomatic kind of puzzle game that has been happening, and you mentioned only parts of it, you mentioned only the most recent one. One could add, for instance, the rapprochement with Israel that has also been taken earlier. To what do you owe this particular dynamic? Is it a mostly regional issue that is coming to fruition at last, or is it related to the global chess game? Someone mentioned Kissinger earlier, that is really also transforming.
Yes, absolutely. I think there are country-specific factors that led to this de-escalation. I think Saudi Arabia, for example, realized that many of the policies it had led since 2015 were counterproductive, whether the blockade against Qatar or several other political mistakes that were committed in the past few years. So Saudi Arabia has decided to hedge its best, to look towards the east. This week, we have seen the BRICS offering membership to the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc. So we are witnessing the emergence of a new world that is perhaps not yet really multipolar, but that is tending towards multipolarity. And those middle powers can, if they properly use diplomacy, if they properly use soft power, play a key fundamental role. They are no longer hostages to one particular camp. During the Cold War, you could take it for granted that Pinochet's Chile would be on the side of the United States and that Bulgaria would be on the side of the Soviet Union. Today, you see middle powers trying to play Russia against the United States, to flirt with France, to send a message to their US patrons that if you are too picky on our human rights record, or if you do not give us a free rein, we have other potential partners. So it's a new game. It's a zero-sum. It's no longer a zero-sum game. A new world is emerging. Someone mentioned that the G20 has become the G2, and it's actually a G0, that every single country, albeit small country with few resources, can become a key player, and countries like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates played a fundamental role in the past 10 years.
Thank you very much, Karim. Professor Legrenzi, I want to turn to you now and asking you the same opening question, your assessment of the dynamics in recent years, geopolitical in the region. But I also want to bring to the attention of everyone, I'm sure they picked it up, the most recent development, which is this invitation that was extended to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE to join the BRICS. And this is also kind of a marker of what we're heading in terms geopolitically of the coming to fruition of these new dynamics. Continuity, change, what are the markers in the region geopolitically in your view?
Well, absolutely. Thank you very much. This is, I agree entirely with the previous speaker. We really are entering a new world. And I say this, I mean, usually the one who are called to talk about the Gulf are the prophets of gloom and doom. And this is what I've been doing for the past 5 years here at the MEM. But now we do have cause for cautious optimism. And what came to mind was yesterday when I heard on the news that in a month or so, on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly, you are going to have a meeting of all the Gulf states, the 8 Gulf states, so the GCC states plus Iraq and Iran. And that to me was really sort of like a defining moment, because I remember, and we are surrounded by young change makers, but when I was young, as a prehistory, it was Dr. Abdallah Bishara was hosting me in Kuwait. I was living in Kuwait, writing my PhD on the GCC. And it stuck with me, came back from the past, this sentence by him. He says, well, what the Iranians would really like is for us to sit down with them without the Americans being at the table. And this is never going to happen. And today, this is happening. So this really marks a change. And the fact that Iraq is also going to be there is also significant. So I think your question is absolutely right. We're seeing this at the global level with this invitation to join the BRICS, which possibly is going to be more symbolic than anything else. I mean, we do know that there is a lack of trust that really prevents sort of like the BRICS from affecting systemic change in terms of like the dollar as a reserve currency and so on and so forth. But no matter, the fact that sort of they're invited together and that this invitation is even like a sort of extended really marks a significant shift. So for the first time, I can come to beautiful Lugano and to very civilized Switzerland to say that there is a reason to be sort of cautiously optimistic. This does not mean, as it was mentioned before, not only that things may sort of like improve in the direction of democracy and human rights at the domestic level. We are talking international relations here, so I should put out this caveat. And also we should remember that there is a inbuilt volatility in the international relations of the Gulf. I mean, sort of like in some of these countries, a person decides and then everything is rationalized post-hoc. So I was there. I was like provost of the Emirates Diplomatic Academy when the GCC blockade was instituted against Qatar, so the mostly UAE and Saudi Arabia. And I can tell you that very few people could sort of like predict that this would happen till sort of a week before. So, but even with these caveats, I think that when it comes to the Gulf, there is sort of like a cause for cautious optimism because of what was said before. And I'm really happy to be here at MEM and to be here at USI and bringing forward this sort of like message of optimism and hope.
Thank you very much, Professor Legrenzi, and I think many people would share that cautious optimism. I think many of the reasons have to do with the domestic transformation, but also the instability of the global scene. And I want to link your comments with the same question to Dr. Bianco, who I'd like to bring in, asking her maybe to expand a little bit, of course, hearing her on the Gulf, on which you've been working, but also the rest of the region, this cautious optimism, this transformation. Do we see this materializing across the region, or are we still essentially beset with the same kind of unresolved issues? Libya comes to mind, of course, where there's been a sort of a continuing crisis since the beginning. But there also, we have had many kind of diplomatic efforts that have not come to fruition. And more generally, what is your assessment of this moment that we are looking at? Please.
Thank you very much. And good morning again. And my thanks to Dr. Frediani and the Università della Svizzera Italiana for the invitation. As you said, I would have wished to be there. Unfortunately, I was returning from a trip yesterday, and traveling in summer always leads to disruptions. So it wasn't possible any longer to be there in presence. But I'm really glad to join such a wonderful panel, and thank you to all of those who spoke before me for their very interesting comments. Also, the keynote speakers raised, sort of helped us focus on some core points, because I think, they fit very well with your question. We're trying to understand what has driven this de-escalation, and if that could become sustainable. And part of this story, as already mentioned, is that governments in the region want to refocus from geopolitical competition that was exhausting resources into exploring opportunities for regional cooperation focused on economic development, sustainable development, the youth, and trying to secure a more positive future for a very peaceful population in the Middle East and South Africa. And it seems, although with some reluctance, also trying to protect the climate and basically the world from self-destruction. So these are, the development goals that are some of the keynote speakers, sort of all of them in one way or another mentioned, and they were part of the reason why governments in the region, I think, have tried to sort of overcome the hostilities. And then there is another part of the story which has already again been mentioned, which is that a realization that confrontation was not leading to, was not bearing fruit, and that the world was changing, the geopolitical order was changing at the global level, and that has direct repercussions on the region as well. So the premise is, the global order changing, that the regional order trying to change, but there still are significant domestic issues in the region. And here I come directly to answer your question. Yes, we are in a situation where for example, the global competition in the Middle East specifically has receded. We are in a moment where regional players are exploring a different path to direct geopolitical competition, but domestic issues in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Libya, they're always there, and they have been there from day one. The reason why there was such a crisis in Libya from 2011 to today it also had to do with very domestic realities, conflicts over resources, the inability to find a new system of governance that brings together the East and West, brings together different interests as well. So it was never only about regional players and global players fighting over resources in Middle Eastern territories. There was also, from day one, about people in these states being unhappy and satisfied with the existing reality, with the governance system, with the economic challenges. And, you know, I find it amazing and also a little bit sad to discover these days, every day, the past week, new protests in Daraa, in Syria. And, you know, it is ironic in a very sad way that we think that, you know, the global players are less interested, even Russia is less interested in Syria than it was before, because it's struggling so much in Ukraine that it has to redirect its resources from Syria to Ukraine. Then we think that the regional players have come to terms with the fact that the regime of Bashar al-Assad has survived the civil war and the war in general, and so they are actively exploring re-engagement. But in Syria, in Daraa, one of the places that has suffered the most from the repression and the crackdown of the regime are still protesting. So that, I think, shows there always were three levels in what was going on in the region. And the one level is still here, and I wonder if there is enough interest from abroad, from inside the region, from outside the countries that are particularly suffering, to constructively now, rather than sort of rapacious, but constructively engage and trying to support solution. Because the sense is that prevailing sentiment is domestic issues need to be dealt with at domestic level, which means that some of these situations, I'm thinking of, for example, so the collapse of governance in Lebanon, could continue.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Bianco. It's cutting off a little bit at times. We're hearing most of what you're saying, but it's cutting off a little bit. So maybe if we can check the tech issues during the next round. And I want to thank you really for highlighting the importance of sort of these issues. There's a tendency sometimes in the West to kind of assume that if the parties in the region are talking to each other, then that's all dandy and all positive, but it kind of sort of sets aside the deeper issues that I think all of you have highlighted, and I want to come back to that and sort of what can maybe kind of endanger this moment of cautious optimism, as you've called it. Adi, I want to turn to you now. So we've heard from Professor Legrenzi references to earlier eras of conflicts which your generation has not experienced. And for instance, it is quite amazing indeed, as he pointed out, to see Iraq and Iran sitting with the GCC if one goes back to at least the first Gulf War. That's the 1981 between Iran and Iraq, not to mention the tensions between the GCC that took place earlier. So in this moment, the youth has been in the region a crucial player, in fact, an accelerator. We speak these days of accelerators of diplomacy, of energy, of transformation. The Arab Spring was one such moment, but there's so many other issues that have played out. What is important to you in this moment and going forward?
I'm gonna have to be an optimistic. Yes, what can we do? I mean, we've all been optimistic here. And after having 10 days of MEM, we have to be optimistic, right? If we look at the geopolitical world, we have two approaches. It can be from the bottom up or up to bottom. And what we've been doing in the last 10 days has been bottom-up approach. And when you make all those people from different MENA countries sit down and talk, you cannot be nothing but optimistic. And sadly, we cannot do it on a geopolitical level, just to make people sit and talk and solve those issues. But if you could take something from the MEM talks that we've been having, the dialogues that we've been creating in the last 10 days, is that young people are the change. I mean, we are going to live in a world that older people are leaving to us, and what we've been trying to accomplish is to create certain and several narratives from our own countries, from our own regions, and eventually you come to a point where they begin by being diverged, and then they become one. And if people can find a solution to do it on a political, geopolitical level, that would be the way to solve those issues. I don't think, so I'm an optimistic, but also realist. So what can we do? So I think the world is not changing too much. We've always had international players coming to the Middle East, or the MENA region if you want, and leaving vacuums or entering and inserting new forces into those cleavages between countries. We've seen that since colonialism, even before the ancient empires. But now we're looking at it from a different perspective because we're all connected. And that's the point of MEM as well. Because if I could name one change that's different from different decades, different centuries even, is that as opposed to other times, we are all connected by media, by social networks, by being able to fly to another country in a matter of hours. Now going from Morocco to Iran is no longer than 6 hours, maybe. In the past, you had to, take a caravan and make your way over there. That would have taken a while. And those connections between people are making the change. So we are able to create a dialogue and name those needed changes. So we do have a lot of issues, and those issues, sadly, are also connecting us. So if we're talking about politics, of course, environmental issues, whether I live in Lebanon, in Israel, in Tunisia, we're going to experience the same global warming and the Mediterranean levels, and everything that's been shared between all those countries sadly connects us. But also, we are able to overcome those together. So I think using those connections and the social media to solve those, as youth, but also utilizing, the older generation, which are still alive, and know, oh yes, and we're
Thank
still
you.
here. You're also part of us. And but the secret that we need to utilize is for us also to utilize our younger generation, because when you look at technological changes, I like that I'm being called youth. I'm almost 30 now, and I feel like I know all the technological changes, but I've been not using TikTok and stuff like that, but knowing how to do so and utilizing youth to do would create the changes that we're looking for. And those revolutions or political movements that you've mentioned, the Arab Springs and whatnot, those are processes that one could anticipate on a certain level, of course, and maybe solve ahead if you know where this is coming from. From my own perspective, coming from Israel, I can tell you that we did not anticipate the current geopolitical, cultural, societal breakdown that we're having in Israel, and that's affecting us. But currently, you could say that we are still strong in fighting for democracy and human rights, and we're doing so by using societal needs and using our social networks, and it is still working. So I'm positive. I'm going to be the optimistic, right? But if we take the realistic approach, I think we are still in a world ruled by, greater nations that are able to create changes, whether it's the US, whether it's Russia, Iran, Saudi, those changes affect us all, and we need to know to, as maybe the smaller players, maybe even only the citizens of those countries, how to navigate through them using our technology and affecting, well, at the end of the day, the hearts of people that we meet. Because if I had to sum up the MEM region, we created connections between people, and now we can talk. Hopefully.
Very good. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much, Adi. Thank you for these points. And thank you for highlighting the transnationalism also that has really sort of come quite the grammar of international relations. And even in a region like the Middle East and the Mediterranean, which has always been connected, the Mare Nostrum, the exchange over the years, the caravans, really has a long, deep history of exchange. But now, with the digital transformation, it has brought all the opportunities. I'm going to take a very quick second round with each one of you, literally 1 minute each, and then we're going to open it up for questions. I think we will have a mic here in the middle, so if people maybe want to line up already, to have that ready, so we can switch quickly to the questions. the panel, and I'll follow the same order. Sort of this moment, I want to go back to it also, and the connection with the global, which is also transforming fast for all the reasons we've mentioned. There's a lot of uncertainties, though, including amongst major powers. Russia was mentioned briefly. It had already repositioned itself in Syria in 2013, was a game changer when we're talking about the end of the American Middle East at the time, if you recall. The Sahel, which has not been mentioned too much, is also a place where it's expanding now in the current context. I think we heard also reference to the danger and the legacy of interventionism, even the colonial era that you mentioned. These are also ghosts that are there in the geopolitical game, not even more than ghosts. They are really kind of absent, present in different incarnations, combined to what I think all three of you at least have mentioned in the importance of the domestic socioeconomic issues, the unresolved ones. What can really sort of throw off this moment that we are seeing, this cautious optimism? What can literally sort of break this momentum going forward?
Well, I think you pinpointed the most worrisome trend on the international stage. We have a return of strong men everywhere. You mentioned Russia, but the same could be said about India, about China, about the United States under Donald Trump, about some European countries that are also going the illiberal way, about the new extreme right-wing government in Israel, etc. And even countries that are supposed to be the standard bearers of liberalism and democracy promotion. Of course, we all know that there was a lot of hypocrisy behind this democracy promotion talk, but at least they would pay lip service to democratization, to human rights, to liberalism. Today, it is no longer the case. And if we are witnessing this full-fledged counter-revolution across the Middle East and North Africa, it is to a large extent because these counter-revolutions were accepted or condoned or even encouraged by certain Western countries. So in 2011, there was a reckoning for a few months after they missed the trains of the Egyptian and Tunisian revolutions. France and the United States started saying that they would reconsider their foreign policies that always were focused on short-term stability at the expense of long-term democratization and liberalism. Today, I'm afraid they have accepted the status quo. They are condoning every single authoritarian leader in the region, even Tunisian Kais Saied is not being reprimanded by any Western country, even though his policies are anathema to what the liberal West is supposed to stand for. So I think
his racist comments.
His racist comments that would be totally unacceptable. I looked at the figures. We only have 0.6% of illegal immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa in Tunisia, and this did not prevent him from talking about the so-called Great Replacement, you know, the extremist conspiracy theory, and of throwing people literally to die in the desert. So this is pretty shocking, and I'm afraid I wish the European Union would take a stronger stand. I wish the United States would no longer give a free pass to all those Middle Eastern despots. Even in academia, we are going back to the old Orientalist discourse that people in the Middle East need strong men, that otherwise we would have either chaos or radical Islamists.
And we know that really has, for many years, was the main criticism that we had of these studies and these policies. Professor Legrenzi, isn't it a little bit ironic that we're seeing the crisis of democracy in the West, that we are all aware of, in a way being echoed by a crisis of democratization in places that were sort of moving towards this with the type of dynamics that are really kind of having this kind of Faustian bargain, seduction of the strong man, and we know that that was for many decades the problem in most of the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, in the southern part of it at least. Sir.
Yes, I mean, I agree entirely with what has been said by the previous speaker, and also with the premise of your question. I must say, though, that probably since happiness comes from the management of expectations, I think that we do still have these humanitarian crises that are wide open. And I'm thinking of Yemen in particular, maybe because I'm a Khaliji person and my sort of like mind always goes back to that. But even because we are in Switzerland, and Switzerland has played a very important role in terms of humanitarian development towards Yemen, and this should always be remembered. But unless we sort of like prevent a new generation of conflict from arising in Yemen, then we're going to go to a situation which is going to resemble the one of places such as Afghanistan, in which the young generations, I mean, far from being a sort of like change makers, are just going to know an economy of war and so on and so forth. So I agree with what has been said. I feel, though, that as of now, I mean, even just of development, not even sustainable development, like the sort of like the sort of cauterizing or like putting an end to this sort of humanitarian catastrophe. And well, maybe since we are in front at a university, I should say that Yemen is also a case study in terms of how a civil war, but a war which has domestic roots and so on and so forth, though that gets participated by regional actors, and regional actors bring their own agenda, and then it becomes immensely more difficult to solve, even when the local actors are finally ready to find a compromise, and we've seen the same in Syria, and so on and so forth. So in my book, like, you know, if this, we can sort of put like an end to this, and like, you know, this is going to be, because even then, like the sort of like the development and the kind of help that a place like Switzerland that is also enlightened can bring becomes of a different kind.
Thank you very much. Dr. Bianco, briefly again, so that I want to get to the questions. You mentioned it actually earlier in your comment. It's a little bit arresting to see that 12 years ago in Daraa, in Syria, sort of the demonstrations that were really sort of the opening salvo peacefully, people dancing and chanting in the street for human rights and democracy, to see that after all this time, after all of the involvement, the different issues that we mentioned, we are sort of circling back to the same protest as we're seeing yesterday, whether this is short-lived. We also saw that, by the way, in Algeria and Sudan, with an Arab 2.0, if you recall, in 2019 as well. It seems to me that unless this issue is addressed and people have this kind of, you know, accountability, representation, respect for human rights, humanitarian issues, as we heard from Professor Legrenzi, unless these issues are really solved one way or the other, all of the other remains rather superfluous. What is your take, please, on this?
I mean, I think that the geopolitical reality is that we are going to see a two-speed region. There are countries specifically in the Gulf who have not dealt with as many domestic grievances and are going to be able to continue developing and perhaps even accelerate. But then there are other countries that had to deal with domestic grievances, and those remained unaddressed and actually became an entrance point for regional and global players who wanted to take advantage of the chaos, if you will, that are left with the same issues just 10 years later. And, you know, the kind of things that people protested for in the Arab Spring are systemic changes in the governance and the whole sort of driving structural forces in these countries. So it's not something that gets resolved in 5 or 10 years. My broader point is that we could continue seeing these sort of incidents, and then this could result in positively, hopefully, in a constructive, slow change, or it could result again in violence. Even in Iran, that's basically what's been happening for decades, right? We've had the Green Movement, we've had just so many different stages of attempted revolution by people against the regime, and it failed every time. But the people come back and, you know, even louder, if you will, because now you also have a few other pressure points, like, for example, climate. And we know that in summer, in some areas in the region, there are still serious problems related to blackouts in hospitals or lack of drinking water, and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Adi, you mentioned Israel. And it's interesting that I think in 2011, 2012, there was a reference to the Israeli summer that was somehow inspired, quite ironically, by the Arab Spring, with the push at the time already of the same kind of issues that we've seen year-long today, a little bit worsened by the most recent sort of government of Netanyahu and the radicalization around that. But here, it seems to me it's the same dynamic. Unless these issues are solved for the society to move away from its perennial militarization and the conflict that we're seeing, these will remain unsolved as such. What is your take, please, on that?
So you want me to be pessimistic?
No, I want you to be realistic, as you said.
Okay, let's be realistic. As you said, Israel has been experiencing, for anyone who doesn't know, we're having, let's call it a small breakdown in Israel. Since the Netanyahu government has come to power in the end of December, basically. They made a coalition after 6 elections, if I'm not mistaken, because I lost count. We had a government for the first time that actually allowed the Arab parliamentarians to join the government, and the Netanyahu opposition managed to actually break it down. To avoid jail, in short, he allowed very extreme people into the government from the right wing, from the settlements, from the Orthodox community, and currently those are the policies that lead Israel. As it is, most of the society in Israel is made up by liberal, democratic people, which most of them are still alive from the time of 48 when Israel was formed. So you can see those gigantic protests that we're now having for 33 weeks, I think. And you see the amount of people, which amount to 100, 2,000, 200,000 people all over the country each week in scorching heat and rain and whatnot. And we are demanding to be what we were so far. And what we see that is very surprising is also the breakdown of the Israeli army. Now the reserve units are not willing to come in to train. We don't have any pilots to pilot our planes. So I would say that it was to be expected. We have a saying in Israel now from, of course, the liberal, wing, that the first person who died in the Israeli upcoming civil war, if you want, was Yitzhak Rabin. Because he was killed, again in short, by an Israeli settler, and they wanted to kill the peace process that we had in '95 between, what is Oslo, or what's left of Oslo anyway. So we see the process. And you could say that to be expected in the Middle East, to be honest. And so to be positive, I would say that it shows the solidarity of the Israeli society, how strong it can be and how we can demand democracy when we were given it from the beginning. Yeah. Teaching democracy is hard. When you go, and we've seen it in Iraq, America came and we're like, okay, democracy, do it. You know how it works. You go to the ballot and you vote. Difficult to do, next to impossible. But in Israel, we had a certain democracy of a sort, and it lived up, and currently it's breaking down.
Thank you. And I think you made an important point in the reference to the assassination of Rabin, which I think a lot of historians will also point out as sort of related to this moment, particularly in the rise of the extreme wings, as he was killed by a terrorist at the time of the right-wing Israeli side. Okay, I'd like to take, maybe we have questions. Thank you, I see in the back some help. We will take one. Sir, if you can kindly be brief in your comment, avoid any long-winded speech, and maybe direct your question to a specific speaker, and then maybe we can take another one. Thank you, please go ahead. We can't hear you. Mike, please.
Hello, my name is Mustafa Sofi and I'm from Yemen. My question is, Dr. Karim, you talked about the de-escalation and optimism movement in the MENA region because there is like a kind of free approach in between Iran and Saudi Arabia. There is a truce between the de facto and Saudi Arabia. My question about the consequences of this kind of optimism. Do you think this kind of re-engagement, normalization, and reapproaching between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Houthis, whatever, will lead for a negative peace to Palestinians, Yemenis, and also Syrian? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Karim.
Thank you, Mustafa. That's a very important question because indeed when we say we are cautiously optimistic, we are talking about a de-escalation when it comes to the proxy wars, etc. But indeed, if you look at civil societies, at human rights, at democracy, at liberalization, this rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia is not necessarily a good news. It was a bad news for the protest movement in Iran. It was a bad news for the liberals and the Democrats because both Iran and Saudi Arabia are in the same camp when it comes to the culture wars. They are both authoritarian regimes. Some academics say that there are two sorts of reactionary currents in the Middle East. One of them is led by Saudi Arabia and the other one is led by Iran, even though this is changing very rapidly. The entire region is changing very rapidly. Lebanon was supposed to be the bastion of liberalism, and they were talking for the past 3 weeks of banning the Barbie movie, whereas Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have welcomed Barbie. So everything is changing very rapidly, but you are perfectly right to point out that when two elephants make peace, this does not necessarily reflect positively on the rest of the region. When two elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. The grass today is Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Syria. But when they make peace, we can also pay the price. And when I say we, meaning the weaker states in the Middle East and meaning the liberals, the Democrats, the progressives, the youth, people like you.
Thank you very much. Do we have another question? Please, this will be the last question. Please go ahead.
This is Safia Ambu Saidi from Oman. My question is going to be a bit linked to my colleague Mustafa. But it's specific when it comes to GCC. I mean, there is so much unspoken normalization of relations with Israel. It's more obvious in UAE and Bahrain, but it's not in Oman and Saudi, though we have seen like few years ago that Oman also and Saudi opened the airspace for Israel. So my question is, why do you think that Oman, Qatar, and Saudi are a bit holding back from that spoken normalization? And do you think we're going to witness it soon, in few years? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very important question. I think, first of all, it's very important to highlight the role that Oman has been playing more discreetly than some of the other players. And thank you for reminding us of that. Professor Legrenzi, would you like to take this, please?
Yes, I think it's an excellent question. I mean, we social scientists don't venture out in predictions, but I mean, and following up what was said absolutely correctly before, just think of the Palestinians. I mean, all of this is happening at the expense of the Palestinians. Now people do not even make a pretense anymore of like prefacing their statements with, just and equitable solution. All those things that we learn when we're studying Arabic and media Arabic, like all these expressions and so on and so forth. And people they're not even sort of like a preamble. So I couldn't agree more with what was said. I mean, like even sort of like when there is a sort of a reconciliation amongst all adversaries, this can happen at the expense of someone else. I mean, like at the end of the day, like Islamic Republic of Iran always gave some political space to Palestinians, even if, of course, they wanted to sort of instrumentalize their cause and so on and so forth. And now they're like at the back of the queue, or they're not even sort of like mentioned anymore. So I agree with you. Will it happen? Yes, I think it will. I mean, here I'm venturing a prediction. You can hold on to it. Of course, there are many moving parts. It's something that there is a little bit of reluctance because, as you know, there is popular sentiment and even asabiya or solidarity with the Palestinians in many of these countries. I mean, grassroots sentiment, which if you study history was always there, so we don't have to be cynical. But that's the direction in which sort of things are moving, even in the other GCC states. They will take their time, but I think this is sort of like the sort of a way forward. So if you ask me for a straight answer, I would say yes, it's going to happen within 5 to 6 years.
Thank you very much. So this is a Swiss panel, so we have to finish on time. This is unfortunately all the time we have. I would like to thank again the organizers, my colleague Suhail Balhaj from the Institute, who has helped as well for the organization of this. And I really want to thank very warmly the speakers. Please joining me in thanking them.